Good evening, and welcome to Chicago Public Library. I'm Jennifer Lezak with the Cultural, Civic, and Literary Engagement team in the Adult Services Department, and on behalf of everyone at CPL, welcome. Before we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones. I would like to thank the Chicago Public Library staff who worked to make this event possible. Books are available for purchase in the lobby, and the author will sign books at the conclusion of the program. Tonight's event is being live streamed on CPL's YouTube and Facebook channels and will be available for on-demand viewing immediately following the event. So tell a friend if they missed it. After the conversation, our guests will take questions from the audience, from those who line up at the microphone in front of the stage, and virtual viewers, please put your questions in the chat. Tonight, Chicago Public Library is pleased to welcome environmental journalist Alan Weisman to discuss his new book, Hope Dies Last: Visionary People Across the World Fighting to Find Us a Future. Alan has reported from all 7 continents and in more than 60 countries. His books include the New York Times bestseller, The World Without Us, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and winner of China's Weijin Prize, and Countdown, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. His work has appeared in Harper's, the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic Monthly, the New York Review of Books, Vanity Fair, Orion, Mother Jones, Discover, Salon, and on NPR, among many others. A co-founder of the journalism collective Homelands Productions, he has also been a laureate professor of international journalism at the University of Arizona. In his new book, Hope Dies Last: Visionary People Across the World Fighting to Find Us a Future, which was 10 years in the making, Alan takes a look at what it means to be a human on the front lines of our planet's existential crisis. He profiles stubborn, clear-eyed, brave visionaries around the world determined to find a way forward. Alan will be in conversation with Allison Cuddy. Allison is a Chicago-based writer and editor. She's the former host of the award-winning program 848 on the NPR affiliate WBEZ and served as artistic director of the Chicago Humanities Festival. She's a board member of the Arts Club of Chicago and a member of the City of Chicago's Cultural Advisory Council. Please join me in welcoming Alan and Allison to the CPL stage.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear all right? All right, good. Well, thanks for joining us. If you want to move a little closer to the stage, feel free. There's plenty of seats. And thanks to everyone who's joining via the live stream. Alan, thank you for this wonderful book. Wonderful, daunting, sometimes anxiety-inducing, but really fascinating read. And I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight. And
well, anxiety induced me to write it.
I'm sure.
And there was some surprising resolution. We'll talk about that.
Okay, good. I will have a little bit of a therapy session while we talk about the book. I wanted to start, though, by asking you to tell us a bit more about yourself in terms of how you came to be this reporter focusing on the environment, focusing on people, working on climate justice, traveling the world to talk to different people. What was the path that led you to this topic and this?
It was a very circuitous path, and I'm not going to take you guys through all the dead ends and wrong turns, but one of them, it was mercifully brief, was going to law school. I'm staying at the Blackstone, I'm right across from Grant Park. And I was in those demonstrations in 1968. And just being there on the corner of Balboa and Michigan just gives me the chills. It's rather amazing. So as a result of that, I wanted to do something to bring the establishment down and do all this stuff. And I was an English major in college. They're not really equipped to do anything particularly. So or at least I thought at the time. So in a panic, I went to law school, and the merciful part was that I was gone by Thanksgiving. And I had done my undergrad at Northwestern, so I came back and I talked them into a work studies fellowship so I could study journalism, the master's degree. And I wasn't really a very good student, but what I remember from that, which really shaped my life, was it was a class in science writing, but it was really just one assignment in that class. in which we had to go to Northwestern's Technological Institute and sit in on a scientific colloquium and listen until we understood what the hell these people are talking about, because they're arguing over a couple of molecules or cross-section of a fly's eye or something like this. And then we had to be able to write a story for popular consumption, not only to explain it, but to explain why should the reader care. And after a few disastrous failures trying to do that, I finally learned that the way to talk, the way to get a scientist to patiently explain to me what he or she was doing was to go in and say, "Thank you, Ms. Scientist, for being willing to talk to me about your molecule for the story that I want to do. I really appreciate your time. And I want to learn about it. But before we get into that, can you tell me, how did you get interested in this thing? In fact, how did you become a scientist in the first place?" And then suddenly I get this life story where these people are talking about, it's always when they're a kid and they saw something, they usually are out in nature, and that thing led them into this obsession with this, and that became their education and their career and their trajectory. And they get so impassioned that basically becomes the way not to just explain it to me, but for me to explain it to readers. What I've learned is that my readers are people. Isn't that a shock? And in order to get them to follow into some of the anxious places that I will go, or the technical places I will go, if I can get them to follow people, they'll follow me anywhere. Look, we're all gossips at heart. We're fascinating. And one thing that really fascinates us is passion. We just love it. We love to feel it ourselves. So these scientists, they've dedicated their life just because of their passion. And it's, if I express interest in them, then they'll warm up to me and they'll tell me all this stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah, you tell a lot of wonderful stories in the book, and passion leads us to the theme, which is Hope Never Dies. And I saw that title, and since you've spent time in Chicago, I imagine you'll know where I go. I think of Studs Terkel and that book that he wrote, Hope Never Dies. Hope Dies Last, thank you.
And Hope Dies Last has this little sneaky double entendre, because it can be what you just said, hope never dies, or in the end, even hope dies. And that was intended because, we're living in uncertain times, in case anybody hasn't noticed. And yet we're still here, so we must still hope that we're going to get through this.
Yeah. Right, and that was sort of the question he was looking at. How do people continue to hope in difficult times? He talked to people who'd lost hope, and then he spoke with people who hadn't. And you focus on the hopeful, which is fantastic. But why hope? Why was that the framework for thinking about the kind of work? It's such a wide variety of people that you portray in this book. Why hope?
Because my editor and I were grappling for over a year with what should be my next book. He was the editor for my previous two books, Countdown and World Without Us. And if anybody here has read them, you know that they are global in nature. Between the two of them, I went to over 30, almost 35 countries, and then a dozen more for this book. So I think about big global issues, even the stuff that's right around any of us, is connected to the globe. I've learned more from ecologists I've been in the field with who study connections than I ever learned in any journalism class. Studs, by the way, was a great early influence on me. I mean, on any of us, though I confess I've never read that book of his. I've read other books of his. But anyhow, my editor and I would have these talks, and at the end of the talk, he would always say, "Man, you think there's any hope left?" And finally we decided, well, maybe that's the question. And I said, look, I don't want to write any Pollyannish thing, hopeful, and and imbue it with great spirit and all that. And I said, I want to find out if there's realistic hopes. What are the realistic hopes for confronting and surviving what have become at least three in the book? I list four, but I call the third and the fourth too intertwined sometimes to really separate. But these are existential crises now that humanity faces. One is the climate. Are we going to be able to slow it down enough so we can adapt to it or mitigate it before it runs away from us? The other, which is integrally related with it, is species lost. We're in a major extinction event right now. It hasn't reached the level of prior extinction events that wiped out 3/4 to 99% of all species on the planet, but we're losing species faster than scientists can count. And we co-evolved with these things. They pollinate our crops. They are our food. They enrich our soil. They do a gazillion different things out there that at one point, if we lose one of them, we may lose one too many. And then we will be one of the losses. And the third thing and fourth thing is that for reasons that I explained briefly in the book, in my book Countdown was all about this, we have been a very successful species on this planet, and so successful that we managed to quadruple our population in the past century. The main driver of that is not modern medicine, though that certainly has helped. But the main thing is that nature grows a certain amount of plant life that can absorb nitrogen from the air and feed it to their roots. And only a few plants really have that capacity to add nitrogen to the soil. And right before World War I, we learned how to pull nitrogen out of the atmosphere, and almost 3/4 of our atmosphere is nitrogen, and to chemically slather it on the ground. And now we grow much more plant life. So in nature, the population of any species will rise to meet the food supply. And lo and behold, that's what we have done. So there's going to be, barring disaster, 2 billion more of us by the middle of this century. How are we going to be able to feed them without damaging this planet further? Because agriculture is the prime mover of species lost. It keeps pushing, we keep mowing down more forests, more habitat, and all that chemistry, that's ultimately responsible for about 1/3 of the greenhouse gases, major driver, plus all this downstream stuff that comes out of nitrogen fertilizer.
So you traveled the world for this book. You go to Iraq, very close to Basra, the cradle of civilization, Bangladesh, the Netherlands, Mexico, all over the United States. I want to have you take us somewhere not far from us. And I'm curious about it as a place I've spent time in around the waters of the Great Lakes and the fight against the Enbridge Line 3.
Yeah.
You go and spend time with the people who are protesting that. They don't win. The pipeline was, they were repairing it, right? Or they were extending it. They called it repairing it. But that project went ahead. But you meet and spend time with Winona LaDuke and other Ojibwe water protectors. And I just wanted you to talk about that scenario, because you write in the book toward the end of it that of all the places that you went in the world to talk about these and to meet these people, the most dangerous was the United States. And it is at that protest that you encounter that danger.
What we're talking about is a pipeline from the Athabascan tar sands in Alberta that comes down through Manitoba, enters the United States, clips a little bit of North Dakota, but crosses northern Minnesota and goes to the port of Duluth Superior. This was, it's been there for some years. Part of it was going through Indian reservations, and it was getting old and was getting very leaky. Now, the Enbridge Corporation, a Canadian corporation, is responsible for the two biggest oil spills, inland oil spills in the history of the United States. And one of them, you people probably know about, because the biggest one, it was up on the Kalamazoo River, and it came very close to your water supply here, Lake Michigan. Enbridge has thousands of oil spills, literally, in their history. So when they wanted to replace a section that was deteriorating, the two Indian reservations said, absolutely not, we are not renewing your leases. So they worked this end around thing where they snuck between a couple of reservations and then over. But that end around thing goes through treaty lands that the United States government and the Ojibwe, which were called the Chippewa in those treaties, they were considered a sovereign nation, and treaties, and as you may recall, and the rule of law is getting a little fleeting in the United States right now, but treaties are sacrosanct. So that treaty allowed them to use these lands for hunting, fishing, and most important to the Ojibwe, because it really defines their culture, the harvesting of wild rice. It was also going to cross over 200 bodies of water, under lakes, under the Mississippi River twice, because the Mississippi goes north and then comes south. And as you mentioned, the Ojibwe women are the water keepers. I think men are the fire keepers. And women were literally lying down in front of the bulldozers and getting arrested. And I went up there to cover a big demonstration. Several environmental groups came up from Minneapolis and joined the Ojibways, and there was a massive demonstration against this. At one point, a bunch of protesters chained themselves to a pipe station that was under construction, and I went in there to interview them, to report on that, and suddenly all these buses showed up with sheriffs and their deputies. The state of Minnesota had been, I wonder if it's libelous if I would say they've been bribed. So I won't say they were bribed, but that's what I mean. The Enbridge Corporation set up a escrow fund to pay for extra expenses for guarding the security of the pipeline. Now, why we are protecting a foreign pipeline that is coming through, that stuff isn't even going to stay in the United States. It's going to be exported out of Duluth Superior, and letting it go under these waters, including the Mississippi, which is half the drinking supply of this country. I mean, you tell me. But that escrow account, which started out at $750,000, ballooned to $8 million plus, because all the law enforcement in Minnesota, not just those counties up along the pipeline, they wanted to dip their hands in the till. So I counted, just from my sampling when they came in, all these charging in battle gear and riot gear that fund bought for them. I counted at least, I think it was 18 different counties, including some down by the Iowa border, 300 miles away. There were probably a lot more, and because I didn't get a full sampling, because at one point one of the sheriffs nabbed me too. And I ended up being thrown into solitary confinement in the Hubbard County Jail. I was strip searched, dressed in orange, paper slippers, asked for my phone call. They said, "Oh yeah, you'll get it." And I kept asking, and I never did get it. So
And that was the way they treated everybody who was arrested there protesting, right? The women that are.
yeah, I guess. I mean, they had somehow in the patrol wagon, they had neglected to zip tie my wrist like everybody else. And I have a cell phone with me, and I got some messages out to journalist colleagues. So I think they let me out because they just kept barraging the sheriff's office with phone calls. And I told them, "Oh, I have got medication left, and I'm really elderly." I mean, hey, I was running around time zones all over the world for this book, but you play every card you can. So I will say this though. My arrest was shocking to me because I'd never been arrested. My attorney in Minneapolis, my expensive attorney in Minneapolis, who got my charges dismissed, most of his clients are black people who, this happens to them all the time. The indigenous people up there, Winona LaDuke, she was arrested 3 different times, and she had to go through all this stuff. All of her charges were eventually dismissed. But they do this to exhaust you and to take you out of the picture as long as they can, to waste your time. And the Ojibwe have been resisting for hundreds of years now. They're playing the long game. They lose this one, but Winona has set up these solar furnace factories to provide good jobs on the reservation, commercial hemp operation to provide better agricultural jobs than the potato fields that only grow potatoes for McDonald's French fries that surround the reservation. It's depressing, but that woman does not give up.
Right.
And she defines, like, all the people that you will meet in this book. That's the fact that they have in common is absolute stubborn. They're visionaries and they're creative, but it's their stubbornness. They just won't quit.
She ran for president, or on the ticket of Ralph
For-
Nader, right?
for
so
vice
she's got to
president.
be stubborn or
Yeah.
determined.
Yeah.
How did you find people, though? I mean, there are all different kinds of people in this book. There are activists like Winona LaDuke, who's also enterprising.
Mhm.
There are scientists. There are military people in the military. There are artists. I hope we can talk about one of the artists you talk about who's working in the Korean demilitarized zone. But how did you find people that fit that profile of I'm stubborn, I don't give up, I lose the battle, but I keep fighting the war kind of thing?
Well, the artist that you mentioned, Jae-Eun Choi, was someone who had contacted me years ago because my book, The World Without Us, has a chapter that's set at the Korean demilitarized zone. She's basically trying to create art that will do what politicians have never been able to do, which is to bridge the DMZ and do a sort of a peace walk, but it's quite elaborate. Shigeru Ban, the Pritzker Award-winning architect, designed it. They showed it first at the prototype at the Venice Biennale, and she's got incredible artists all over the world who are going to create these pavilions. It's going to be a walkway, and it has to be a walkway over the DMZ because there's so many landmines in there. You don't want to step in it. In my book, I had described how this no man's land had reverted to wilderness and became one of the most important wildlife refuges in all of Asia. And she loved that. And so I went to Korea when she announced her project and her hope to get North Korean artists also connected.
So her project was inspired by your writing about this?
When you live in Korea, you know the DMZ.
Yeah.
She saw something in my writing that really fit her
Sparked this.
vision, and which, you know, I was very touched by that. So I went there and I met her, and I ended up doing an article. It was like a New Year's special article for the Los Angeles Times, and I updated that because there's a whole new phase to her project. So I updated it for this book. But, you know, I read constantly. I spend every morning reading a gazillion newspapers to see what is going on. You know, I read them on the internet. I read scientific journals. I am aware of some people who are doing some really interesting stuff. But what I always do is when I find someone who I want to talk to is I ask them, who else should I be talking to?
Mm-hmm.
And people give me suggestions. And some of it is just, you know, like incredible serendipity. Can I mention about the cradle of civilization?
Yes,
You brought that
please
up.
do.
Okay. So this book begins in the beginning, literally. It begins where not only the cradle of the civilization, the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, where their floodplains come together, but it's also believed by archaeologists and biblical scholars to be the site of the Garden of Eden, which is described in Genesis as where 4 rivers come together, and 2 of them are named, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the other 2 correspond to a river that comes down from the mountains in southwestern Iran and comes up through Saudi Arabia and Kuwait. To me, creation in the Bible doesn't look that much like something that happened 13.6 million years ago. It looks a lot like the end of the Pleistocene, when most of the moisture in the world was still locked up in these big glaciers. So the seas were 300 feet lower. So you can imagine this quadruple river delta was this fertile paradise for our hunter-gatherer forebears. And Genesis 1 describes that. You know, I give you all these plants for everybody. But Genesis 1 also, there are Akkadian, Assyrian, and the original Sumerian versions of these stories. But our forebears, you know, would go out and they gather this grain, and then they'd drop some. Oh, look at that! You know, this handful of grain, everything sprouted right there. And then they learned that instead of just going out to hunt every day, you could capture some animals. They'd made ropes out of vines, drag them back, make rope out of corrals out of ropes or out of vines, and then you could eat them at your leisure, and they would breed in captivity. So by Genesis 2, we're no longer gatherers. We are tillers of the soil, and we are pastors of these animals. But not for long, because a couple chapters later, there's this flood event. So the Assyrians and the Sumerians, they all talk about that too. How come? Because the Pleistocene glaciers were receding, they were melting, the seas were rising. Archaeologists say that, like, every generation, they had to move several kilometers upstream. Well, one of the reasons I went there is because the seas are rising again. You know, this time we're pushing them up, and we're pushing salt up the Tigris and Euphrates. But I also went to meet the first visionary that I describe in this book, a man named Azam Alwash, who was a Iraqi civil engineer. He had fled during the worst of Saddam Hussein. But he grew up in this area. He grew up fishing in this floodplain, which is this gigantic marshland. It's the biggest wetland in the entire Middle East. But during Saddam's reign, in between the 2 U.S. invasions, there was an uprising among his own country, men and women, and he believe that so many Shiite rebels were hiding in these marshes because there's these 12-foot tall reeds. Believe me, you can get lost in there. That he decided to divert the waters of the Tigris and Euphrates away from it to flush them out of hiding. And this incredible, gorgeous, precious wetland turned to dry dust about the color of your seat backs. As I've seen parts of it, that it just, it's horrible. So Azam Alwash came back out of exile in the United States after Saddam was opposed, because he wanted to get the water back into the marshes. And he was told by all these government people he talked to, and then he talked to the U.S. State Department when we were still occupying, and he went to Europe trying to get fundraisers. Everybody's in biologists, they all said, no, it's not worth doing it because everything out there is dead. The roots of the plants are dead. It will never revive. And he said, and this is a phrase that I heard over and over again researching this book, how do we know unless we try? The surest way to fail is not to try. So finally, after 2 years of trying to raise money with no luck, he and a fellow civil engineer who actually was born in a reed boat, just like the Sumerians used to use, out in the middle of the marshes. They were just standing on the dike just saying, what are we going to do? And the guy says, I know where there's an excavator. So instead of raising hundreds of thousands of dollars, for $30, they rent this excavator and put about another $30 worth of diesel in it and bring it down and punch 3 holes in the Euphrates dike, and all this water comes rushing back in, fills the marshes, and then it just stank for high heavens for about a month, and it looked awful, and it looked dead, but then green shoots started to appear along the edges as cattails came up, and then papyrus, and then these phragmites, these reeds that are so big and thick that the Sumerians and even the people today, they're called the Madan, the Marsh Arabs. They make these incredible reed houses where they bind them together into thick, strong columns, and they connect them in an archway. So once the plants came back, then they saw kingfishers and ibises and egrets coming back, which meant that the fish were back. And then they started seeing otters and badgers and boars and Euphrates soft-shelled turtles. And today it's a functioning ecosystem again. And all these marsh Arabs who had to go live on dry land somewhere, they're back out there on these islands that float around. Literally, they're made out of impacted reeds. And I was privileged to spend several days out there with them. It was just wonderful.
Yeah, it's an amazing story. It's a fraught story too, because as you said, rising sea levels and really fully restoring the marshes is threatened by that. It's threatened by Turkey and the dams that they're building that's reducing water that's coming into the area. It's threatened by our desire for oil. And I was curious, like in reading that, the solution in some ways, or at least the start of the solution, was so simple, to use a backhoe and to break through the dike. There are other people in the book. You talk to a guy, John Platt, who works for Google, with Google, and is looking for what he calls like the strong energy miracle, because weak energy miracles like that are maybe simpler to implement, like wind or solar energy, right? Winona LaDuke creating a solar energy company and having great success with it seemed like easy to implement. He says they're too expensive for CEOs. They don't make them profits. So why do they, when you think about a guy who kind of, or people who are doing these simple things and are trying to make these things happen, and then you think about this other whole regime of CEOs or companies, oil industry, who are calling the shots. Why do they get to call the shots?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's in the chapter in the Netherlands, which I went to because all the countries in the world are looking at the Netherlands now, trying to figure out how they managed to keep from drowning for the past 1,000 years. And one guy from Friends of the Earth, Netherlands, who sued Shell Oil for not protecting the world's population, um, uh, and actually ended up winning the lawsuit, though they had to reduce the plaintiffs down to just people in the Netherlands. Um, but a prior case that had sued the Netherlands that I talk about in the book, it's really a thrilling story, had also been successful. And Shell Oil, after they lost, they did not wait for the appeal after Royal Dutch Shell. For 130 years, they dropped Royal Dutch and they moved to London. So, and that's absolutely indicative of what this guy told me. He says, 25 CEOs, they would fit in a small city bus, are responsible for half the emissions on Earth. And, that both makes the problem seem like, wow, these guys are powerful. How can we possibly touch them? And also, hey, that's only 25 people that we have to change their mind or get rid of. I mean, civilization has been going for about 8,000 years since those glaciers receded. The oil industry has been going for about 150 years. And you will meet people in this book who are doing their damnedest to get rid of fossil fuels or the products of fossil fuels, such as artificial fertilizer or plastic. You mentioned John Platt. John Platt, I talked to a lot of bright people. John Platt went to college when he was 14, and he went to Cal State Long Beach because he was still living with his parents. And one of the things that he would do while he was studying computer science is that he would go up to Mount Palomar and work with Shoemaker, and he discovered 2 asteroids that he named for his mom and dad. It was really sweet. And then he went off to Caltech, and then right from there he was doing things like he put the touch and the touchpad on your computer, and handwriting recognition by computers, even in Mandarin. He won an Oscar for getting animation stuff for clothing and animation to ripple naturally. And he had a great career at Microsoft, but Google lured him away to, they offered him to run their AI climate program. And this is a guy who's got young sons, and he's really, really, really worried about what the future is going to be for those kids. So he's been working, really hard. But he in fact, I just heard from him yesterday. I mean, solar and wind, if we decentralize the way that we pull power, we harvest electrons, we could do it with just that. But the people who have centralized control, either utilities or energy companies, power is a really addictive drug, and they don't want to let go of it. And one of the strong energy things that John mentioned to me was something that I'd already gone to see for this book. And that is something that has sounded like pie in the sky for the past 50 years. And that's fusion energy. The idea of basically trapping a star on Earth. In the center of the stars, it's so hot, the electrons are literally ripped off the atoms of gases, and it becomes a substance called plasma, not to be confused with blood plasma. And plasma has all these hydrogen atoms in it, because that's what stars are mostly made of. Sometimes the inner gravity of a star will push them together. And when they go together, they fuse into a helium atom. And Einstein described that there's going to be a little mass lost when that happened that lets off a lot of energy. So if we could do that on Earth, and we actually have done it, but it's always taken more energy to put in than you get out of it. Well, MIT is one of about 6 groups all around the world, either institutions or companies, that are racing to bring us fusion energy because it's climate driven. This is something that potentially could get those CEOs' attention because it would be a lot cheaper. You don't have to mine anything. The feedstock is recyclable seawater, and a quart of it would power your life for a year. So in this chapter, I go to these. The director of that plasma lab has been teaching a fusion reactor design class for years, and one of his design classes made an enormous breakthrough. They figured out a way that to hold the plasma steady, you need these huge magnets, and they're very costly and very energy intensive. They figured out how to do it with much smaller magnets. So now they have spun off a company, so they don't have to deal with federal funding, and which is a little iffy these days, and they've raised about $2 billion in capital, and they are currently, as we speak, they are building 2 things on the outskirts of Boston. They are building a fusion reactor that will fit the footprint of a coal-fired plant, so you could just hook it up to existing power lines. And they are building a factory for these magnets because they want these things to be mass producible. You don't need PhDs to build it. Any contractor could follow the instructions and also be able to service it. So if fusion works, that will be one of these big energy things. And I'm not real comfortable. Man, I went to one of these classes, as the director told me, the most brilliant 23-year-olds in the world. I understood nothing, and they were speaking English. But I asked them about themselves, and they kindly explained.
Right. Did a good job. So if it works, and the obstacles to things working, we see in this book time and time again, we've talked about some of them, like that the political winds can change, and something that has wind or has legs then goes away. It really doesn't matter what political party is in power. They don't. And then you also have, like these business interests or other kinds of interests that can get in the way. I think this might take us back to the Netherlands, but did you see models for how do you take these ideas beyond venture capital and sort of save them or keep them safe from the political winds or these other kinds of obstructions so that they can keep trying to develop them?
Well, there's a woman that you'll meet in this book. I was so honored to meet her. By the way, Azam Alwash won the Goldman Environmental Prize for bringing back the marshes, and it's considered the environmental Nobel. And this woman, Mariam Manesma, also won a Goldman Prize for doing, she did a couple of things. She had a bunch of degrees, and she was teaching green energy development in Eastern Europe, and then got asked to lead a sustainability institute at a university in Rotterdam. And after a few months, she realized that all these PhD students were going to write these books that 10 people would read. So what are we really doing? So she and her co-director came up with what they called an urgent agenda for 2050, all these things that would have to happen. And the leading Dutch newspaper picked it up. And then they got thousands of emails from people who really were concerned and wanted something like this to happen. So they formed this NGO called Urgenda. And one of the first things she did was look around and see that nobody was putting up solar panels except for a few businesses and some really rich people, because the government would give you a little subsidy, but basically cost 80 to 100,000 euros to solarize your house. And she said, that's not necessary. And they said, no, this is what it costs. So she emails these thousands of Urgenda members who had signed up, and she said, how many of you would be willing to put up $35,000 euros to borrow that much if you knew that you could pay it off over 15 years, and during that 15 years you'd never have to pay another utility bill? Your payment would be pretty much what you're paying for energy right now, and then after that your energy's free. And she got enough people to do that. So she flies to China, buys 50,000 solar panels, and comes back. And today, Urgenda will solarize your house in the Netherlands, which means 20 solar panels, an induction stove, an electric water heater, plugins for your cars, and do all that for 35,000. So she did this great end run. And then there's this wonderful story, and I sort of alluded it to before, this prior lawsuit. She sues the Netherlands for not protecting their people, and she gets 886 plaintiffs to join her. And the Netherlands was signatory to all of these grandiose UN things saying industrialized countries will lower their emissions by 2020, 25 to 40% and all this stuff. And of course, they weren't doing anything. And the courts agreed with that all the way up to the Supreme Court. And they forced the Netherlands to drop their carbon emissions by 1/4 by the year 2020. This was in 2018 when The Hague delivered that opinion. And I mean, there are ways to organize and do things, and that's what we have to keep doing.
So that kind of gives us a sense of how the collective vision might grow from these. But I'm curious, you alluded to it earlier. You worked on this book for 10 years, and we're in a moment where we're entering a different world order. And a lot of the projects that you talk about, there's DARPA, the really innovative research arm of the Department of Defense and the Pentagon. There's HUD funding things. There's USAID that Azam Al-Haj first approaches when he's trying to get the marshes back to come back. There's a lot of government support for scientific research in different universities. That's all no longer a priority of the current administration. So are you keeping up with these stories? Do you know what the impact is of these moves? I mean, we're not that far into this administration, but
I'm constantly keeping up with them. I've got this update file of articles that just gets longer and longer. Look, this is a really significant setback. This is the last thing we needed. As I study the whole panorama of natural and human ecology, I mean, I understand how this stuff happens. When people are frightened, they are easy fodder for demagogues. That was old news when Machiavelli wrote about it. And with the hollowed out middle class in the United States, there's a whole lot of people who got frightened in their 20s that they were never going to be able to advance or even afford a home, and that their kids are going to have even a worse life than they are, and have these crappy jobs. And there are plenty of climate deniers out there, but they know this is happening. Everybody on this planet knows that the weather is changing on us. So those kinds of fears are ripe for someone to come in and say, oh, don't believe that. It's just a fluctuation. Weather's always fluctuated. Things, but deep down, people are scared. Well, this is terrifying, but it's also kind of clarifying. The United States is not the center of the world the way it used to be. There's this country called China that's manufacturing all those solar panels, manufacturing all these electric vehicles right now that charge in 5 minutes. Countries all over the world, Norway, 85% of the vehicles now are EVs, and that's a pretty cold country for solar energy, but they're mining the sun up there. We know how to do this. The United States is now, it's, North Korea, the United States, Pakistan. There's a couple of, really retrograde countries, and I'm sorry that we are one of them, and I hope this doesn't last for long, and it won't. You will meet in this book a very valiant group of self-described nerds, queers, dweebs, Gen Zers who are screaming truth to the face of power, and they are daring politicians and CEOs who take money politicians who take money from the oil companies. They are leaping up on stage when these people are trying to talk and saying, "You are frying our future." Explain to these people why, or say promises that you're not going to do it again in public. And they've run some of the people right out of their jobs. During the Trump administration now, some of them are going to jail, but 11 new chapters have just opened up. They keep coming. So this is the spirit that by the end of doing this book, I started this because I was really, really worried. I'm still worried, but I'm so uplifted by all the people that I met who time after time convinced me that this ain't over.
Well, this ain't over either. And if any of you have questions, we welcome you to come up to the stage where Jennifer is.
Yeah, come on up to the mic if you have a question. And we have one from our virtual viewer, one of our virtual viewers here. And she says, as a teacher, one of the things I think about for environmental protection is science education. And I fear that our students are not competing on science as other countries. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, what a shame. We've got more universities than any country on earth. We have written most of the scientific literature. It used to be Germany. We really surpassed them. There's a chapter that's set in the Marshall Islands that are probably going to disappear. I was watching king tides just pouring across the land. But I was with a group of kids. In the Marshall Islands, that's where we did all that hydrogen bomb testing. It's pretty ugly. We treated that worse than we've treated the worst Indian reservation. It's now a sovereign nation, but it was a U.S. colony for a long time, and it's a shameful part of our history. And the kids who grow up there don't have much future. But now, thanks to some ex-military from the United States, who are some of the most principled, conscientious people that I've ever met, who worked in humanitarian relief during Iraq and Afghanistan, and now are doing disaster relief. They're funded by the Roddenberry Foundation, that's the Star Trek people, and they get funding from the Office of Naval Research, or at least they did until Elon Musk. Let's say they have figured out a way to keep going. And one of the things that they're doing out in the Marshall Islands is a sustainability lab where they are inviting all these U.S. corporations from Silicon Valley you meet all these young people there who have startups that they want to do well by doing good. It says, good, come out here, put your money where your mouth is, develop these things, help these people have a better life while they are here, and give them some good jobs too, maybe some we'll patent some products with them that they can benefit from. But what these kids are doing is studying STEM. So when they have to go into the diaspora, they will have some skills that will make them welcome rather than rejected by the country that they end up in.
All right, I'll read one more from another virtual viewer. It says, Alan, I'm a fan of all of your books, and I'm wondering, what is your next book?
Yeah, I'm wondering that myself. When you see this, do you have a copy of it with you there? Okay, so this is a thick book. Don't be daunted by that, because almost an inch of it is my acknowledgments thanking all these people. And I write these narrative acknowledgments like an extra chapter, but also there's a very long bibliography in small type. After I turned in the draft of this book and through the editing process, there was an arduous fact-checking process, all done basically by me.
Incredible.
And, I mean, mistakes in a book, because books are big, it's like a radioactive half-life, you get it, and there's still half left, and there's always still some in there, but I tried to really, really minimize that. And this book just swallowed me. In the now promotion, this is the 7th city on a book tour, and I haven't had time to think, but almost any chapter in this book could be a book unto itself, so that's one possibility. And as was brought up by a prior questioner, there's stuff going on in the United States right now that probably should be addressed. Maybe it's my turn to scream to power.
It does seem you'll need to follow these stories given everything that's going on and how they'll be impacted.
I've kept in touch with everybody in the book that I write about, and they're out there still plugging. And, just like the story I told you about Azam Alwash, I mean, you'll meet some people who have pulled off some minor miracles in this story, and some who are trying some really way out solutions. I mean, I'm not someone who believes that technology is going to be the solution to the problems that technology has, the messes that technology has created.
Mm-hmm.
But I think at this point we have to try everything. And technology is a tool. We've been doing it forever. Those Sumerian reed houses, beavers build dams, birds build nests. Our technology has been wonderful for a long time. I go in this book to Uruk, the oldest city on earth, where the wheel was invented, where writing was invented, because they were doing so much business with trade on the Euphrates that they needed to. We literary and poetic people cringe when we hear this, but writing was really created for accounting first before, And all those cuneiform tablets, most of them are lists of products that were sold. But if you think about that empire there that started with the Sumerians and up to the Babylonians, it lasted for 5,000 years, and they never burned petroleum. The Roman Empire never burned petroleum, maybe just for candles or for torches. The Mayan Empire, and so we jet propelled, and we get to do all this cool stuff, including this microphone that's amplifying my voice. Well, we now have the technology to harvest electrons without burning things. And we have to stop burning things, and we have to let our forests come back. And that will make this world livable for our children and grandchildren.
It's been wonderful speaking with you. Thank you so much. Before we let you go, just quickly, what's one thing all of us can do if we're all looking for hope right now as we walk out of this auditorium? What should we go out and do?
Well, in a lot of my talks, people have said, what about my children, my grandchildren, where's the hope for them? And I said, there's two things that you need to do with your children and grandchildren. First of all, it's hard to extricate them from their glowing screens. In part of the reason is that as real reality has declined, virtual reality has ascended, and that's a world that they get into, and everything looks still kind of perfect. But take them into nature. They may go kicking and screaming at first, but insist on going for walks. And I mean, some of the most formative events in my own life were the 2 times that my father took me on nature walks, because I can remember them. And you go out there, and but then you see something, and you get curious about it, and it's really neat. And you ask, the kid will ask you about it, and you may or may not know the answer. And the next time you go out, the kid will tell you about it, because they will have gone onto the internet to find out. And then nature, after an hour in nature, you feel better. And nature may just be Grant Park, but something where stuff is growing. Because we've banged this planet pretty hard, but it's still beautiful out there. That baseline, there's something to really come back from. I'm going to interject something before I tell you the other thing you should do. Because at one point in this book, I make a little pilgrimage. There's a chapter set on the Mesoamerican Reef that starts in the Yucatan, goes down past Belize and Guatemala and over northern Honduras. After the Great Barrier Reef, it's the longest reef on Earth. And I was down there with a bunch of scientists who were talking to coastal managers and refuge managers and about how to use natural things like sand dunes and mangroves and oyster beds and stuff like that to slow the rise of sea level and to move with the changing coastlines. But at one point in the Yucatan, I stopped in a village called Chicxulub, which you've never heard that name pronounced probably, but you've probably read it, because this is the place where 66 million years ago this asteroid hit, and 75% of all living things died, especially these enormous reptiles that for 160 million years ruled here, except for a few very small, tiny feathered dinosaurs that were able to dig into the ground or whatever and survive. And they're still alive today. You probably heard some of them singing to you this morning. And there was also a little shrew named Purgatorius. That's our ancestor, yours and mine. Because that big, empty, dinosaur-wide niche was a perfect place for mammals to jump in. So I wrote this book hoping that we can be survivors as well, just like those feathered dinosaurs that are still flying. The other thing I want you to tell you to do with those kids is take them to museums, take them to art galleries, take them to concerts, because when they fall in love with nature, as they will if they go out there enough, they may get angry at the human race for the damage that we've done. And I don't want them to grow up as misogynists. You don't want them to hate people. And if you take them to places where they can develop a love for the arts, that's some of the highest expression of our humanity, our souls. And that will fill their spirits. Religion can do that too, if it's done right. And I even touch that base in this book. You'll meet some religious leaders in this book, because it's really important. Any way that we can get to belief in the validity of Homo sapiens spirit, and that our survival is justified in this planet, that's worth trying. But if not, the planet has come back from lots of major extinction events. It'll come back from this one too, only we won't be around to enjoy it. I hope that doesn't happen.
Alan Weisman, thank you so much. Alan's going to be signing books out in the lobby, so please join him.
Thank you
all
very
for
much.
being
Thank
here.
you so much, Alan and Allison. I want to remind you that this was a live stream.